I can't see the participants. I can just see the four of us. Oh, okay. Very good. Now I can see them. Okay. Um, I'm sure uh, there are still going to be a few people signing in, but uh, let me at least start with the introductions. My name is Alan Levinson. I'm the Schusterman Josie Chair of Jewish History here at the University of Oklahoma. And on behalf of Professor Hervé Pichery, we want to invite you to our fifth annual Schusterman Center's joint Zoom event. We started this. I see Jonathan's on in the audience. We started this joint event 5 years, 6 years ago. And the idea was that the two Schusterman centers on the Southern Plains, the third being in Boston, should get together, get to know each other, get to know each other's faculties, and should collaborate and bring in distinguished scholars, especially in areas where UT Austin and OU Norman don't do primary teaching. In other words, we've had Samira Mehta, and we've had the David Kaufman, who spoke in our inaugural talk on the Jews Indian, the interaction of Native Americans and Jews in the principally the 19th and early 20th centuries. And that's what we've been doing. And I hope we can keep doing this a long time, because I think it's a great collaboration. And this year, we're very, very happy to bring in Professor Jordan Finkin, who will be speaking on Jewish Humoresque, Jewish humor as a way of knowing. And Professor Finkin is well known to a lot of us. I'm going to do his formal introduction in a moment, but I'll say he's well known to us as the go-to guy for questions about Yiddish, especially how to translate it, how to transliterate it, what's available in the original and where, what's available in translation, and what's a good translation. And he's just the guy that you call when you have some question regarding this. The formal introduction is as follows. Jordan Finkin is Deputy Director of Libraries and Rare Book and Manuscript Librarian at the Clow Library of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. I will digress for a second to say this is one of the great Jewish libraries in America, and I've been very, very fortunate to work there on a few occasions. Professor Finkin is a specialist in modern Jewish literatures. Dr. Finkin is the author of several books, as well as numerous scholarly essays and articles. His most recent book, Exile at Home, explores the work of the Yiddish poet Leib Nadis. Dr. Finkin is a literary translator from Yiddish, but also German and French, which I just discovered. He co-translated with Alison Schachter the award-winning collection of short stories by Friedel Stock from the Jewish provinces. He's also the founder and director of Nidus Press, a nonprofit publisher of Yiddish literature in English translation. And we were, Professor Pichery and Professor Finkin and I were just chatting before the start of this webinar and saying one of the things we desperately need is good translations from foreign languages so we can teach them in our classrooms across the United States. So Dr. Finkin is contributing his efforts to this and expertise to this really noble endeavor. And I just want to greet everybody to this fifth annual UT Austin OU Schusterman Center's collaborative Zoom event. And Professor Finkin is speaking today on Jewish Humoresque. Jewish humor is a way of knowing. And Jordan, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Well, thank you very much, and to the Schusterman Center at University of Oklahoma, as well as the Schusterman Center at the University of Texas. Of course, thank you very much to all the munificent Schustermans for their support of academic Jewish studies. You know, all of our deepest appreciation, and of course to Rona Seidelman and Alan for this invitation, and another thank you to Alan. For the promotion. I'm not a professor, but I guess for this afternoon's talk, I will be. So thank you again for that. So a few preliminary thoughts before I get started. And I think it's important when talking about humor that there are a couple of funny things about humor, that we really only recognize what's funny based on an uncontrolled physiological response, that is laughter, right? It's kind of an unusual intellectual subject where you actually have this involuntary thing that tells you whether a joke's hit or whether humor is funny. And it's just something to bear in mind. I mean, these are just things I'm putting out on the table. A couple of other things to note: that humor is immediate in both senses of that word. That is to say, it's instantaneous, and there's nothing mediating our response to that laughter, to that moment, to that to how the humor lands. And so as a result, there's a curious problematic of off-color humor. That is, a joke may be terribly offensive and we laugh at it nonetheless, right? So this is a deeply unsettling kind of a reality to think about, right? That there's an ethical component to a discussion of humor, I think is an important thing. I don't know if I'm going to get into that in great detail, but that's something always to keep in mind when we talk about humor, and that our discomfort clues us into something cultural. And the cultural specificity of humor is something that I will get into a little bit more as I go on. That culturally intrinsic element, you know, my parents, well, I was born in, I grew up in Dallas. So actually, I have to say, as a quick aside, to me, having grown up in Dallas, it was a long time ago, but seeing UT and OU on the same sheet of paper made me do a double take. So there's that. But they moved to Dallas. They're both New Yorkers. They moved to Dallas from New York, and they watched Woody Allen's Sleeper when it came out in the movie theater. And they have a distinct memory of being laughing hilariously when the entire movie theater is in dead silence. And so, right, that we, again, the immediacy of the response, but the cultural specificity. To run it up, curiously, if we think about Seinfeld, right? Seinfeld as a national phenomenon is deeply Jewish humor. As a national phenomenon is befuddling in a way, right? That where we got to that point where this deeply local and culturally specific humor can be in effect nationalized across great swaths of the country is another interesting question, and we could talk about that maybe a little bit in the question and answer period. But so before I begin in earnest, just a few apologies. First, I forgive the fact that taking jokes seriously sometimes makes them sound strange. Getting under the hood of a joke impedes the immediacy that I just talked about, which is what stifles laughter, right? There's nothing worse than someone trying to explain a joke. Also, forgive my reading from a text at certain points, but many of these jokes require a correct setup, or else they'll also fall flat, and that's something I don't want to do. And third, I know many, if not most of you, don't know Yiddish, so I will try to keep that to a minimum. But where it does have to come in, I ask for your forbearance. I will try to explain as much as possible. So the rabbis of the Talmud were concerned deeply concerned about levity, and their discussions reveal a tension between, on the one hand, the tendency of levity to lead to moral decay. So in Pirkei Avot, it says, Chok v'kalut rosh margilin le'erva, laughter and frivolity predispose one to lewdness. It's news to me, but that's what's in the Avot. And on the other, the ability of humor to alter our receptiveness to truth. The Babylonian scholar Rabbah would routinely begin his lessons b'milta di b'tichuta, which is to say, a word of humor. So while I'll return to that specific point later, I take this as a rabbinic injunction always to open with a joke. And who am I to argue with tradition? So it once happened that a ship was sailing on the sea, and it shouldn't happen to you. There arose a gale, and the ship started to shake and pitch about, just like with Jonah. If you know how to read, you've likely heard of Jonah. Okay, I'm going to take a quick aside here to step outside the joke for a moment. This invocation of Jonah, and especially to reading Jonah, is not fortuitous. It's actually felicitous. This is a culture in which exploring a text is the definition of learning and indeed of knowing something. Okay, back to the joke. And the ship was tossed about, and water started pouring into the ship, and nothing helped. The ship sank. And however many people were in the ship, it shouldn't happen to any Jews, they all drowned. Of all the people on the ship, only 2 Jews survived, and they arrived at the shore. The people on the shore saw the Jews and asked them to tell their story. So the Jews told everything that happened and how the ship went down and everyone drowned. And the people asked, "Nu, and you really know how to swim that well?" And they answered, "Swim? God forbid. We were just having a really nice conversation." Okay. So I have to add, okay, I thank God for Alan and Hervé. It's a little disconcerting to talk about Jewish humor and not being able to see if anyone's laughing, if the jokes landed or not. So I just have to soldier on. I'll assume that they will, and that maybe I've tickled the risibles a little bit, but okay. As this joke shows, and as I'll describe in what's going to follow, the world of Jewish humor and its most salient representative, the Jewish joke, is one not only of language but of speech and performance. So, what is Jewish humor? Whatever it may be, it defies essentialist definitions. If for no other reason, because the term is way just far too broad. When we speak of Jewish humor, most often we are referring to modern Jewish humor. There is, of course, humor in the Bible. Yet, despite a number of interesting inquiries and case studies, I will deflect biblical arguments for a couple of reasons. First, there's too narrow a corpus to make more than provisional conclusions. The Bible looks big, but it actually isn't that big. And secondly, there's too great a distance in time and culture to determine if something was actually meant to be funny, whether or not we take it as such. That is, the cultural specificity of humor prevents a usefully clear understanding of biblical humor. Moreover, as Jefferson Chase has noted, there's a communicative instability at the heart of humorous speech acts. That instability becomes downright volatility over the course of long spans of time. Indeed, it would be very conjectural argument indeed to call biblical humor even Jewish. And the Talmud, too, the whole rabbinic corpus, certainly contained humor, but the nature and purpose of those texts make the humor ancillary or didactic, and rendering it harder to articulate what its nature actually is. As a result, again, what we are talking about when we're talking about Jewish humor is really modern Jewish humor, and actually, I would argue, Ashkenazi humor, born and bred in Yiddish-speaking Europe. And as I will argue, that specific cultural context is the single most important contributing feature to what we generally refer to as Jewish humor. So to make a very rough, and again, this pretty much all we've got, definition, Jewish humor is more than a system of risibility, of laughability, or something which is designed to elicit laughter, though it's that also, but rather it's, you'll forgive me, an epistemological system. That is, Jewish humor is a way of understanding the world, an active, participatory, discursive method for coming to know, especially one in which semantics, an active study of meaning, is the primary tool. So, there are two primary ways of looking at humor in this way. One is phenomenally, with an eye towards content, and the second formally, with regard to structure, composition, all that stuff. The first was pioneered by sociology and psychology, and the two names that appear most commonly in this connection are Henri Bergson, with his book-length study Le Rire, The Laugh, and Freud, of course, with his jokes and their relation to the unconscious. So I'm going to avoid making too much of it, but it shouldn't go unremarked that both of those men were Jewish. In any event, the psychological approach has, in some sense, dominated the conversation. Not completely, but it's dominated the conversation about Jewish humor. The idea is effectively a kind of group psychology of Jewish humor. I'll simply point out the common pitfall of making generalizations about the group based on conclusions about individuals. Freud's theoretical apparatus of the human mind, after all, was based on a small number of wealthy, neurotic Viennese Jewish women. So we have to take everything with a grain of kosher salt. That said, what is one to make, for example, of the following couple of jokes? That a kind of social pathology is at work seems clear. Okay. To a Jewish shtetl, there once came a circus. In the circus, there were all kinds of animals, and among the animals, there was a bear. If it one day came to pass that the bear got loose from its cage, how and why you shouldn't ask, it just did, and that's that. The bear began to run around, so the police commissioner issued an order that whoever found the bear should kill it. People in the town were quite frightened of the bear. One Jew said to another, "You know what? I'm going to flee the town." "Why?" "What do you mean, why? Haven't you heard that the police commissioner has ordered the bear be killed?" "So, what do you need to flee? You're not a bear." So the Jew replied, "First they'll kill the Jew and then prove you're not a bear." Okay, and here's another one. Around here, they don't let you onto the train platform without money. If you want to get onto the platform, you have to buy a ticket for 10 kopecks. There's a machine that when you deposit a silver 10 kopek coin, it gives you a ticket. A Jew once came and wanted to get a ticket, so he sees that written on the machine it says you have to deposit 10 kopecks. So he thinks to himself, whatever, I'll get a ticket for 5 kopecks. So he takes out a silver 5 kopek coin, drops it in, but no ticket comes out. So he says to the machine, "Shah, don't be upset. You'll get your other 5 kopecks. Just give me a ticket and we'll be done with it." So he deposits another 5 kopek coin, but again, no ticket comes out. So he thinks to himself that the machine is nothing but a scam. Meantime, he sees an officer come up and deposits 10 kopecks, and out pops a ticket. So he says to the machine, "Me, you didn't give a ticket, but you do to the goy? You're some common anti Semite." Okay, so the Jewishness of the joke doesn't necessarily consist of the narrators ultimately landing on anti Semitism as the logical cause of the injustice. Though the fact that it's within the conceptual framework is part of the structure of the humor. That a military officer appears in the scene makes the presence of a potentially real anti Semite actually quite likely. Rather, the Jewishness lies in the Jew's dialogical orientation to the world. First, that he thought he could bargain with a vending machine, which in Yiddish is an automat, that is, an automaton. And second, that the problem is a result of his own presumptions about being able to bargain in the first place. The bargaining Jew being one of the most consistent internal and external stereotypes of Jews. So consider, just on that point, consider the joke about the submarine, where Goldstein is manning the weapons station and an enemy sub has launched a torpedo. Goldstein says, "Captain, the torpedo is at 3,000 yards. Should we fire?" "Just wait." Goldstein says, "Captain, it's 2,000 yards. Should we fire?" "No, it's all under control." Goldstein says, "Captain, it's 1,000 yards. I think we should fire." "Steady on." Goldstein says, "Captain, it's 500 yards. Fire the torpedo. I'll pay for it." So, returning to the previous example, the one before this, right? This other bargaining example. First, there's the automaton, the automat, then the bargaining, and third, that his entire thought process is performed aloud and conversationally. By the end of the joke, you could just about believe in the possibility of an anti Semitic vending machine, a slide into the absurd that makes the joke that much more delicious. So, since Freud's time, there has been much written on the psychology of Jewish humor, about the externalized self criticism, about the coping mechanism of subaltern and subjugated people, about laughing through tears. All valid, perhaps, but in my view, it only takes you so far. I am more interested in the second, that formal aspect of Jewish humor, and that I think is what I'm going to focus on today. So, if we begin with the proposition that laughter is universal, but humor is local, the basic meaning is straightforward, namely that humor is to some extent culture specific. That's what I began my conversation with. For example, you know what they say about German humor, that it's no laughing matter. But in all seriousness, however, to hone in on the German case for just a moment, in his thoughtful book on the debate over Jewish humor in German culture in the early 19th century, again, I'll quote Jefferson Chase, he makes a terminological distinction. Wit, Witz, came to stand for the production of laughter through displays of analytic cleverness, whereas humor, humor, for a benevolent appreciation of life's general absurdity. That is, the term humor signaled what were acknowledged as autonomous cultures, hence the idea of German or English humor, whereas the word Witz designated groups subordinate to the mainstream. The idea of Judenwitz, Jewish humor, therefore entailed an understanding of Jews as a recognizable entity within German society, possessing a particular interested mode of discourse. So within the Jewish cultural system, however, humor and Witz, humor and wit, in some sense coalesce. Jewish diaspora culture is always attuned both to the mainstream culture in which they live and to the way they are perceived within it. So my larger claim is, while humor is not exclusive to the Jews, nevertheless, within the Jewish cultural system, humor is Jewish. And you can't really talk about humor in this context without talking about, as I have been all along, jokes. What I want to mention now, and I will stress later, is the relationship between joke telling and storytelling, a relationship that's both intimate and complicated. So instead of asking the tricky question, what is a joke? I think you actually can start to say something useful about them by asking instead whether one can make a distinction between a narrative joke and a funny story. Because it is the particular artifice and the structure of the joke that allows it to function in certain ways. So I'll begin this section again with a joke. When one tells a joke to a farmer, he laughs 3 times. The first time he laughs when you tell him the joke, the second time when you explain it to him, and the third time when he understands it. A nobleman laughs twice. One time he laughs when you tell him the joke, and the second time when you explain it, because in any case he doesn't understand it. An officer only laughs once when you tell him the joke, because he won't let it be explained and he doesn't understand. But a Jew, when one tells him a joke, says, "What are you talking about? That's an old joke," and he can tell the joke better. So I've taken this notable example from what is in effect a collection of jokes gathered by Immanuel Olsvanger entitled Rote Pomeranzen, Red Oranges, first published in 1921. This story is the very first example from that book. Now, there's of course, a thematic reason why a collection of jokes would begin with what an academic might call a meta joke, that is, a joke about joke telling itself. However, it also reveals something of precisely the Jewishness of the activity that the book will proceed to describe. So I'll speak in a moment about something I call Jewish discourse. But first, you should note about this particular joke the weight it places on one-upmanship, on competitive engagement, which are part of the key to understanding Jewish discourse. So Olsvanger opens his introduction with the following statement. Allow me to present you with this edition of Yiddish folk tales that I took down just as they were told to me by the Jews of Eastern Europe themselves. So what's so telling about this? First, they're referred to as folk tales, and secondly, they're orally repeated and collected. So with regard to the first, how is this a joke? How is this joke a folk tale? The short answer is it is and it isn't. But Olsvanger was not careless with his labels. What we see is a problem of fuzzy terminology. Two things, two categories, which are distinct when seen from outside a culture, namely the folk tale and the joke, overlap when seen from within that culture itself. The second important okay, I'm running out of time. So I'm gonna sort of poke around a little bit in my so I was going to talk a little bit about orality, but I think I'll connect to the folktale bit now. If I can digress, I've given a version of these various remarks several times over the years, and the issue of Sephardi humor keeps cropping up, and rightly so. I mean that's a big blind spot in humor studies. Part of this has to do with the fact that the volume of writing on Ashkenazi humor is so utterly dwarfs what's devoted to Sephardi humor. Generally speaking, the material that does exist tends to situate Sephardi humor squarely within a framework of folkloristics. Um, and I would give you some bit about Franz Rosenthal and his humor in early Islam, but I think I'll skip that bit. The single most common feature, well, I'm just looking at the time, and I want to make sure I get. Um, okay, we can talk about Sephardi humor in the break. There must be some way, some reason why the category of Jewish humor is so abundantly filled in the Ashkenazi context and underexplored in the Sephardi one. Part of this has to do with a broader unfamiliarity with Islamicate cultures generally in the West. And another is, as Don Ben Amos has noted, that the textual basis for the whole idea of Jewish humor as it developed in the 20th process. This material is part of what of reifying a category, but a category that exists. Um, let me take a little detour to talk about Jewish humor, a Jewish discourse, which I've talked about a little bit so far. Within Ashkenazi culture, the study house milieu of Yiddish-speaking scholars they debated the Talmud, a text which itself presents the discussions and debates of rabbis on every conceivable aspect of life. When this Eastern European Jewish prestigious elite came into contact with their wider Jewish culture, some of their vocabulary, grammatical features, modes of argument were absorbed into that culture. Why should they be absorbed? Why shouldn't they be absorbed? Right? There's a joke presented in Freud's student Theodor Reich's book on Jewish humor, in which a German officer asks a Jewish recruit, "Why should a soldier sacrifice his life for the fatherland?" To which the Jewish recruit responds, "You're right, Lieutenant. Why should he?" Though the contexts of these jokes are far apart, this shoulddative humor, what I call shoulddative humor, this play on verbal modality, is the link. So this is a joke I paraphrase from Olsvanger, but I think it's a perfect encapsulation of that. It also appears in Freud, but in not the same form. Two Jewish businessmen meet on a train. One asks, "Where are you going?" "To Warsaw for grain," says the other one. "Oh, yeah? You're telling me you're going to Warsaw for grain because you want me to think you're actually going to Lodz for cloth. But I happen to know you really are going to Warsaw for grain. So why are you lying to me?" Freud has a lot to say about this lying by telling the truth. And I think its importance, however, lies in its satiric stance. It can only be effective as satire if everyone understood fully well what was being satirized in the first place. That is, if everyone got the Jewish humor that was embedded within it. Um, Okay, I'm going to put that aside. Okay, I'm going to give you a longer joke, but it will exemplify precisely this notion of Jewish discourse. Um, we had in our shtetl a coachman whose name was Dovidke. It's not, to modern ears, it's not such a funny joke, but that's not the point. Okay, so if you don't laugh at this one, there's nothing wrong with you. Okay, we had in our shtetl a coachman whose name was Dovidke. When one when one would call him coachman, he didn't like it at all, as he used to say, "I'm not a coachman. I have a wagon and a horse and I drive, and whoever wants to ride along, let him ride. But I'm not a coachman." That's because the profession was not a high class profession. And as for driving, he used to drive with wisdom. One night there was a big storm, and just that night he departed on a long journey. Some days later they asked him how he got through that night. So he says, "It was a difficult journey, but I drove with great mental acuity." So they asked him, "What does that mean, drove with mental acuity?" So he says, "I drove by means of a kal v'chomer and a gezeira shove." Now I'll take a quick break. Kal v'chomer and gezeira shove are technical terms in the Talmud for logical operations of rabbinic argumentation. Technical, right? An a fortiori inference and an argument by analogy. Back to the joke. So listen up. Having set out several miles that night, a wheel of my wagon gets in its head to fall off. So what do? I drive with a kal v'chomer. If a little cart on two wheels can go, then my wagon with three wheels will certainly be able to go. So I drove on. I hadn't continued for 2 minutes when another wheel fell off. So I gave it a thought and found a gezerah shove. Just as a little cart goes on two wheels, so I will go on two wheels. And I drove on. Another misfortune, and a third wheel fell off. Do you think I got rattled? Perish the thought. I drove on with a kal v'chomer. If a sled without wheels can go, how much more so will my wagon with only one wheel surely go? So I drove on. The fourth wheel then also up and fell off. So what is one to do? I drove on with a gezerah shava. Just as a sled goes without wheels, so my wagon will go without wheels. And I drove. Don't ask what became of me and my passengers in my wagon, but I drove. So this fascinating text, I think, can be picked apart endlessly. But what I want to stress is the practical force that the coachman believes these logical and argumentative strategies actually exert on the real world. The logical structures of Talmudic debate, embodied as tools meant to negotiate reality, are actually able to persuade the coachman to stay on course, throwing common sense completely to the winds. And that a coachman, a low status profession whose typical occupants were generally not textually educated, and certainly not in the technical world of rabbinic argumentation, essentially still understands and employs such logic, tells us something about the diffusion and assimilation of these otherwise elite practices into the wider Yiddish speaking culture. Okay, which brings me back to the question I had to begin with. What is a Jewish joke? Does such a thing exist? To quote Ted Cohen, the philosopher, Jews have no monopoly on jokes, nor on good jokes, nor even on jokes of a particular kind. And yet there is a characteristic association of Jews with a certain joking spirit. That is, as an historical issue, the question with Jewish jokes is why such humor comes to be understood as, taken as, Jewish. Cohen rightly asserts that it is impossible to define Jewish humor. However, one may describe it or characterize it, which he does as follows. It's the humor of outsiders, and it exploits a deep and lasting concern with logic and language. Um, let me, I'm gonna, because I'm kind of coming to the end of my time and I had more material. So I want to make sure I get the stuff that I want to get put in. Okay. Cohen's description is probably about as close as possible to come to a definition. It's far easier to analyze forms of humor or their components. And I'll just mention a couple as they'll relate both to my argument and to my argument in general. There's the so-called shaggy dog, where a series of similar events keep occurring, prolonging the joke until the punchline is reached, just like the torpedo joke earlier. And then the argument from multiple possibilities. Here's one of the latter. In 19th century Russia, a young Jew is told he's to be conscripted into the army. So he asks an old Jew for advice. Ah, there's nothing to worry about, says the old man. Just go into the army and things will turn out well. How can you be sure? Well, when you've joined the army, there are two possibilities. Either you'll be sent to a combat group or you won't. If not, there's nothing to worry about. If you're sent to a combat group, there are two possibilities. Either the group will be sent into combat or it won't. If not, then there's nothing to worry about. If the group is sent into combat, there are two possibilities. Either you'll be wounded or you won't. If not, there's nothing to worry about. If the wound is mortal, there are two possibilities. Either you'll go to hell or you go to heaven. If you go to heaven, there's nothing to worry about. If you go to hell, there are two possibilities. Either they take bribes or they don't. If they take bribes, there's nothing. If they take bribes, there's nothing to worry about. Of course, they take bribes. That's arguing for multiple possibilities. I have a whole riff on Freud here, which I don't want to get into, and then another riff on Paddy Chayefsky using exactly the same. Um, Let me again see. I'm editing on the cuff. This is what Okay, there's no better example of the particular Jewish discourse within jokes than the following joke, and for which you need to know that a kasha is a particular problem, a difficulty in a Talmudic text, and a teretz is its solution. Once a yeshiva bacher entered the study house and saw one of his friends running around back and forth, holding his head in his hands, yelling, "Oy vey, good, fine, oy vey." And he asked him, "Shmerka, what's with you that's so good and fine? Why are you yelling?" And Shmerka says, "Oh, brother, do I have a teretz? It's gold. It's genius. The one problem is I don't have a kasha." Like, Jewish joke is, in a sense, a teretz in search of a kasha. It's an answer to a problem in search of a problem for that answer. The couple of other characteristics, I know I'm over time, but I want to mention with regard to jokes, and this is important, is concision and then again delayed punchlines, because it's a particular Jewish style of joke telling. The principle of concision, again from Ted Cohen, explaining a joke or setting up a joke, as I mentioned before, with all the necessary presuppositions and required information, encumbers it, makes it contrived. Jokes involve concision of some kind. That is, they can be short and they can be long. However, as Cohen says, what matters is what makes the concision possible. What makes it possible is that so much can go unsaid. What can go unsaid? Why can it go unsaid? Because the audience already knows it. A second characteristic is the delayed punchline. And by that, I'm referring to those jokes that act as a kind of Chinese box, right? When it embeds one joke or it tricks you into thinking that the joke's ended, and then there's right. Which it's an element of jokes that Freud actually takes up and talks about at some length. But I'll give you an example here. A Melamed was teaching his students, that's a teacher at a traditional Jewish school. In the middle of teaching, he remembered that he had to do something in the attic. So he told the children that until he came back, they had to repeat and memorize some passage or other, and that then he would examine them on it. And should they not understand a word, they were to go outside and ask him. The teacher left and the boys started studying. They understood all the words except for the one they didn't understand, mimailo. Now, the humor is bound up in the fact that the word in Hebrew means from on high or up above. And the Yiddish word here is hecher, the translation, which means both physically higher and louder acoustically. So a boy ran out of the cheder and yelled to the teacher up on the attic, "Rebbe, what's the meaning of mimaila?" The teacher answered, "Higher." He thought the teacher hadn't heard, so he said he should speak louder. So he yelled, "What is the meaning of mimaila?" So the teacher replied, "Higher." So the boy yelled, "What's mimaila mean?" And the teacher angrily yells back, cursing at him in frustration, "A devil take your father." So the boy went away. And then when the teacher came back, he asked, "So have you done what I told you?" "Yes." "So Yankele, translate the verse." Yankele started translating, and when he came to the word mimaila, he said, "A devil take your father." The teacher got very mad and gave the boy a slap on the cheek. So the boy started to cry, and his friend said to him, "How can you speak that way to a teacher? To a teacher, you use the familiar form. You have to say, 'A devil take thy father.'" So here we see beautifully the weight placed on overturning assumptions, questioning propositions, and displays of analytic brinkmanship from the opposite direction, right? These Looney Tunes uses of language within the traditional structures. So to summarize where we are, and I promise I have 2 pages left, so I promise. Okay. There are four differences between joke telling and storytelling that make up a set of guidelines for our characterization. The nature of the relationship to Jewish discourse, the punchline as a conceptual organizer, concision, and contrivance. I began by making a distinction between things viewed from within a culture and from without. Jokes become all the more interesting when seen not only through the lens of difference, as I just described, but also through the lens of similarity to storytelling. In a keen ethnographic analysis of storytelling in Eastern European Jewish society, Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett outlines a basic scheme concerning when storytelling occurs and in what form it usually takes. As a basic rule, quote, there are various types of speech events in which stories play an important role, and though not defined by the society in terms of storytelling, these events may require that stories be told, may be dominated by narration, will be structured so as to accommodate tale-telling, and will influence the form of the narrative performance. Many of these structural accommodations to storytelling can often allow jokes instead of stories. Within this framework, Kirschenblatt-Gimblett makes a basic characterization of storytelling in which the essential division is between a story as a summary and a story as something in its own right. These latter are more likely to accommodate jokes. In brief, this is what I call the principle of substitution. Joke telling in these instances can easily fit into certain slots culturally assigned to storytelling. In effect, this is an elegant way of accounting for the similarities between joke telling and storytelling. Namely, they are treated as alike enough that they can both occur under some of the same given conditions while still being understood as somehow different things. So, by way of conclusion, let me return to the meta joke about the Jew who, when he hears a joke, can tell it better. This is very much the case in a number of Jewish cultures. And part of my goal has been finding a way of accounting for Jewish humor as a cultural product. But I think it goes beyond that. Humor is part of a Jew's being in the world. Within the cultural nexus of Jewish discourse, humor is an important way of making sense of the world, of coming to know. That is, as an epistemology. Jewish discourse plumbs ideas by turning every angle, overturning assumptions, testing every possibility. In this pursuit, one of its most powerful tools is irony. That is the realm of humor. That's how the coachman can navigate the perils of the storm by great mental acuity. And it's within that discourse that one is able to say, parodying a Talmudic saying, Ezehu Gibor Hakovesh Yetzer Hara, who is the hero, he who can suppress his evil inclination? But instead, in Yiddish, Ezehu Gibel Hakovesh Agleichwerpel, who is a hero, the one who can suppress a joke. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jordan. That was wonderful. Uh, uh, I think now that anybody who would like to raise the hand or use the chat box, I think I'll be able to navigate this pretty well, and uh, I'll repeat any questions or comments out loud, and then Jordan can speak to the whole audience.
Sure.
Okay. Um,
And I do have to apologize right from the beginning that I cut out some bits, so there might have been some discontinuities. But I think the overall arch was more a landscape, a tour d'horizon, than a very nitpicky argument. So I'll just leave it at that.
I guess I'll start off since I'm not seeing any questions and answers yet. What do you think about this re rebirth of stand-up comedy in the last decade or so. It seems extremely popular, and I would say that there are at least a pretty good handful of like Modi, and I don't know if you've listened to him, and other Jewish stand-up comics who are sort of breathing a little fresh life into Jewish humor. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm not as familiar with a lot of the, well, let me put it this way. Technology is not my thing. So if it's gonna be on TikTok or YouTube, that's my kids, that's not me.
Got
Um,
it.
but but I will say that the notion of stand-up comedy, of shtick, of this kind of thing, it's the fact that it's taken over in a way, and then it gets to be reinvented is a fascinating to me is a fascinating reality. Not that Jews invented stand-up, but for the American market, it is very much taken as one of those iconic kind of Jewish humorous pastimes, really. I mean,
Yeah.
if you think about it, the 2,000-year-old man, which is effectively a stand-up routine, right? Carl Reiner just is there just to bounce stuff off of, right? And but it wasn't scripted. This was shtick they did at cocktail parties. They just sort of do it, right? This is a sort of a mode of enjoyment. Now, what's interesting, I'm not a historian of American humor. There are people far more qualified, but it strikes me fascinating that there was a moment when, let's call it immigrant humor. That is not solely Jewish, but Jews were big, right? That just dominated. It wasn't always there. It came across in waves of immigration, right? That there was an earlier American style of humor, right? Think of W.C. Fields, right? Yankee humor, right? Whose last gasp, I guess, is what was the there was the Mainers who had the albums. Bert and Me. I don't know if anyone remembers Bert and Me. Bert and Me. The main humor, but this Yankee style, very straight faced, very. I mean, sort of. It, Not a lot of people. Some people find W.C. Fields funny now, but it's not resonant as a pan American art, comedic art form. But right after that period, this waves of immigration come, and that destabilization, but that infusion of new crazy, right? How do you deal with this new crazy reality that you find yourself in? Um, Becomes iconic. And of course, it happens to be come into its own first in the radio era and then into the advent of television. So you're in the right place at the right time in order to create this entire vocabulary that you just can't get rid of. You know what I mean? You can't sweep it aside. It's here to stay. But the Jewish discursive elements are so tightly part of it that it's fascinating that the Jewish discourse has to be reinvented within it, as you were saying, Alan. These new Jewish stand-up comics are reinvigorating from within and not from external forms, but within the form itself, which is absolutely typical of Jewish creativity in that space.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I see that there are some students uh, uh, on the webinar. Do you want, if anybody has wants to offer any questions to Dr. Finkin, or offer any of their favorite stand-up comics, that would be or humorous. That would be pretty welcome.
Hey, look, I'm happy uh, to have proven my point.
I think you have. Well, I never do know how to do this on a webinar, but if everybody could just please uh, thank Dr. Finkin for coming and well, joining us today. Oh, I'm sorry, Hervé, excuse me. I see you.
No, no. Sorry, it was just a quick comment. First of all, it was a wonderful talk, and a lot of these jokes reminded me of French jokes. So that's an interesting connection. But in particular, the joke of having found a solution, but the problem is you don't have a problem
Right.
for it. If I'm right, that's Alfred Jarry. That's how he defines pataphysique,
Hmm.
which in France becomes this sort of big early avant-garde movement. So it's interesting to me that it's the same joke, but situated culturally differently, right? This is kind of high culture,
Right.
avant-garde versus, I assume, popular or folk culture.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, that that's a wonderful analogy, and I love that. And what I like is that it reinforces that, right, that Jews don't have a monopoly, as I said. They don't have a monopoly on humor or on
Mhm.
particular forms of Jewish humor or of humor, or particularly on a particular joke.
Mhm.
Right? We know jokes that occur in other contexts that are you know not a Jewish joke, right? So there's material out there that clearly moves, right? There's impulses to look at the world in certain ways, right? And so the avant-garde especially, right? I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
that's it. The avant-garde especially matches onto the notion of Jewish discourse's overturning of all assumptions,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's very much that it's the same impulse that's there.
Yeah.
With regard to cultural specificity, I thought you were going to say something about the French, and so I was going to be very, I don't know, but what I will say is that, for example, Sholem Aleichem, the great Jewish Yiddish writer of the late 19th, early 20th century, comic writer,
Mhm.
right? He had some serious stuff, and but this was a comic writer who wrote in a comic space. And I have there's a whole second half of this talk that's for other purposes. Um, you couldn't find a reader of Yiddish when he was publishing his material who didn't find it funny.
Mhm.
That was the point of it. They got it all.
Yeah.
If you translate it into English in a good translation, American readership today won't find it funny.
Mm.
It's not humorous to them,
Yeah.
right? They'll get it. They'll get a sort of the echo of a Fiddler on the Roof, blah blah blah. Okay, even if you get rid of that, they'll know that something's being ironic or something is intended to be funny, but
Mhm.
they don't laugh. You know what I mean? This immediate response. It's not risible to them.
Yeah.
Sholem Aleichem translated into Russian, however, is very funny among Russians.
Yeah.
Among a lot of Russians. I mean, it's all speaking to
Yeah.
it, but among a lot of Russians is actually very funny,
Yeah.
right? So what is you see there is a cultural context in
Mhm.
which these things are enmeshed
Yeah.
that is essential to the humor of them, which is why I started when I talked about biblical humor not being Jewish humor.
Yeah.
It may be I have no access to the laughter in the
Yeah.
Bible. I have
Yeah.
access. I know where something's trying. Probably there's humor there, and the rabbis especially. I know that something's being funny.
Mhm.
You maybe even smile a little bit, but it's not right because there's a different cultural context involved, and
Yeah.
the point is different,
Yeah.
right? They may have taken humorous material that was out there
Mhm.
in the world and retooled it for the purpose of a debate about whatever the Talmud's debating about, right?
Mhm.
So it if you pull it out of whatever context, social or
Mhm.
intellectual or doesn't matter,
Yeah.
right? That unit you can use just like your joke, just like the whatever this
Mhm.
joke thing. But if you plop it into another context, it doesn't
Mhm.
necessarily work the same way.
Yeah.
It doesn't operate the same
Yeah.
way, and it certainly won't make you laugh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But and that That reminds me, of course, of the fact that the French are absolutely crazy about Jerry Lewis and Woody Allen in a way that uh, Americans appreciate them, but not as much as the French. So yeah, there seems to be some sort of contextual work that
Yeah.
reinvigorates or alters the original.
Like who is it? Like what cultures are attuned
Yeah,
to the discursive moves in the same or similar ways to Jews that it, right? Like it's
absolutely.
like connecting, we all have 15 different plugs depending on what iPhone we have, right? And you just keep trying to, some fit, some don't, that's
Mm,
kind of the way that the humorous flow of electrons isn't gonna work.
yeah.
You get to this, you get to this, I know what these are, but until it hits,
Hmm.
there's no magic. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Anyhow, thank you very much. This was
Yeah.
great.
My play, look, I get to talk about jokes. What's not to like? Thank you.
Um, okay, unless I'm completely screwing it up, which with me is always a possibility in technology, I don't see any questions. So let's everybody just uh, let's give a hand to Dr. Finkin. Thank him
Thank you
very
very much. I
much.
really very
And
much appreciate it. Yes, and thank you all for coming and for listening to me yak on for a while, or
it
yuck
was
on for a while, depending on.
thank you so much. That was
Yeah,
great.
my pleasure.